Let us halt our discussion on the French Revolution for a while and talk about the age of explorations that happened between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Well, you must be questioning what happened during the age of explorations. During this time, sailors and voyagers from different European countries and monarchies set sail to different parts of the world, and they were now discovering new lands in the Americas, Africa and Asia. And after these sailors and voyagers traveled to these new virgin lands, they established their own colonies there. And during this time, that is during the age of explorations, the European powers set up their colonies in different places. Now, while they set up their colonies in different regions of the Americas, Africa and Asia, they now started taking over the power and control of those regions. Because a colony is something that means that the power over that region now passes into the hand of the colonizer. So these European powers now became the colonizers in these various regions. Now, why do you think were these European powers very keen on establishing their colonies in different parts of the world? This is because these new regions which were discovered by the sailors and the voyagers were very rich in different kinds of resources. And by establishing their colonies, the Europeans were able to exploit the people there and extort all the resources from those regions. These resources were then brought back to Europe, and from there finished goods were then sold in different parts of the world. So this is how trade activities now began following the age of explorations among the European colonies in different parts of the world and the European nations. And what we talked about pertains to the trade relationships that developed between the colonies and the European powers. But I'm sure you are very tempted to question as in what happened to the native people who used to live in those regions. Because suddenly these people now found themselves colonized. They were no longer autonomous and independent because the European powers took control over the lands and the people who lived in those lands. What do you think happened to those people? These natives were then treated very badly, and unfortunately enough, after the Europeans took power and control over those regions, that is over those colonies, the natives of those places were then reduced to slaves. From this, a very important question that comes to the fore is that what do we mean by slaves? What do we mean by the practice of slavery? Well, the practice of slavery is a condition in which a person is deprived of their basic rights. And the slaves are then compelled to work in inhuman conditions. And since they are compelled to work, often unwillingly, they are brutally tortured. So slavery is a condition in which people now lose their autonomy. They lose their rights over themselves. And when people are treated as slaves, they are reduced to properties, and even they are bought and sold in markets. So from this we can understand that slavery is a dehumanizing practice. It is a horrible practice of treating human beings as commodities, as properties who are supposed to render unpaid labor, and if they failed to do so, they were brutally tortured. So this is what we mean by this practice of slavery. And very unfortunately, when the Europeans took control of those regions and established their colonies, slavery became very, very prevalent in those new discovered lands. Now, we began this discussion by talking about how the European powers were setting up their colonies during the age of explorations. Likewise, France had also established its colonies in North America as well as the Caribbean islands. Now, the Caribbean islands are a group of islands in the Caribbean Sea, and the Caribbean islands are situated between the North America on one hand and the South America on the other. Now, France had many colonies in the Caribbean islands, among which we should mention Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo. Now, these colonies were very productive for the French economy. Why do you think it was so? This is because these colonies were very important suppliers of different kinds of commodities like tobacco, indigo, sugar, coffee. Now, while we discussed why these European powers had set out to establish their colonies, we mentioned this point that the primary intention behind the setting up of colonies was the exploitation of resources. And here we can see a very good instance of that. In these colonies, as in San Domingo, Guadeloupe and Martinique, France used to exploit the resources that were available there like tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. Now, in order to make any kind of crop grow, a lot of intensive labor is required. Now, do you think these Europeans were willing to leave their safe and happy places in Europe and travel to the faraway Caribbean islands to work at these plantations? Most definitely not. These Europeans were very reluctant to go to the Caribbean islands and work at the plantations. But France saw that its economy depended to a great extent on the resources that were available in these Caribbean islands along with the North American colonies. Now, what do you think did the Europeans decide to do? As in, who did they compel to labor at these plantations? Well, this now brings us to a discussion on a slave trade that began around this time. Now, between the 17th and the 19th centuries, the Europeans started shipping a large number of Africans to the North American and Caribbean colonies. And these Africans were enslaved. That is to say, they were treated as slaves and they were compelled to work at the plantations. And this process of shipping slaves from Africa to work at the North American and Caribbean colonies was known as transatlantic slave trade. Now, in this transatlantic slave trade, these enslaved Africans were shipped to the North American colonies as well as the Caribbean islands. Now, here they were forced to work at the plantations, and after they provided their labor at the plantations, the raw materials and resources from these colonies were then shipped to Europe. And it was in Europe where these resources and raw materials were used to manufacture finished products. And from Europe, these manufactured goods were then sold in the markets of Africa as well as in different parts of the world. And this process of shipping the slaves was known as transatlantic slave trade. Now, this transatlantic slave trade was a very brutal practice because the slaves were treated absolutely miserably when they were shipped from Africa to the North American and Caribbean colonies, as well as when they were compelled to work at the plantations. Now, let me ask you a question before proceeding with this lesson any further. Among which continents did the transatlantic slave trade take place between the 17th and the 19th centuries? Did it take place among Asia, South America, Australia, Europe, Africa, North America, or North America, South America, Europe, or Asia, Africa and Europe? Which of these following do you think is the correct answer? Well, the correct answer is Europe, Africa and North America. So, the Europeans sailed from Europe to Africa to enslave those Africans, and then these enslaved Africans were shipped to North America and the Caribbean islands so that they could render unpaid labor at the plantations there. Now, having talked about how this transatlantic slave trade was very prominent between the 17th and the 19th centuries, let us now focus on the French kingdom alone. Now during this time, when transatlantic slave trade was taking place, the French ports of Nantes and Bordeaux became very famous and popular. This is because it were from these French ports that French merchants sailed to the African ports. And when they sailed to the African ports, there they bought slaves from the local chieftains in Africa. So can you understand how horrible a practice this was? Because human beings were not treated as humans. They were not even given and granted their individual rights. These Africans did not have any say over what was happening with them. There were the local chieftains in Africa from which these rich French merchants bought these slaves. And then these slaves were shipped to North America and the Caribbean islands, as we just talked about. Now during this process, the slaves were branded, shackled and shipped to the Caribbean across the Atlantic Ocean. And since they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, this practice came to be known as the transatlantic slave trade. Now these people, as in these Africans who did not have any say, who did not have any autonomy in this process, were treated absolutely miserably. They were brutally tortured because they were branded and treated like properties. They were shackled and they lost their independence. Here you can see how a couple of Africans are being treated absolutely miserably and they are being forced to enter the ship. And here you can see there are the European men who are in control of these purchased slaves. So as we mentioned, the slaves were shipped in the most wretched conditions. Now if you look at this image closely, will you be able to understand what is being shown here? I'm sure you'll be very surprised if I tell you that this is one of the many arrangements in which the slaves were shipped to the North American and Caribbean islands. Because here you can see it was as if these people were not humans and they were like small matches who were stuffed in a matchbox. They were not even given the space that they required to survive properly. And after they were shipped in this horrible manner, they were then brutally tortured in the plantations. They were beaten, they were not given proper food, they were not given the space that they required to live. They had to live in absolute inhuman conditions. They had to live in places which were unhygienic. They had to suffer from various kinds of diseases because they did not get the food that they required for their sustenance. So this is the way in which the Europeans were brutally treating the enslaved Africans. Now what we have discussed all this while tells us that the European powers were not very willing to give up on this practice of slavery. Because this practice of slavery and exploitation of slave labor helped to meet the growing demands of different kinds of things. Because the Europeans knew that people from their own countries and nations and their own territorial units will never go to work at the plantations, and so they had to exploit these Africans who did not have any say in this process. And by exploiting slave labor, now France along with many other European powers was able to meet the growing demands. So for this reason, the French monarch was also never willing to give up or end this practice of slavery, because it now helped to meet the growing demands of sugar, coffee, indigo in various European markets. In fact, the French ports of Nantes and Bordeaux also owed their prosperity to a great extent to this exploitation of slave labor, because the slaves were bought in auction by the French merchants, and these French merchants kept on gaining more and more wealth, which in turn contributed to the prosperity of these French ports. Now when the French Revolution broke out, this issue of slavery was now being discussed among the masses. Now, some parts of the masses thought that this brutal practice of slavery should be put an end to, because humans cannot be treated the way these slaves were. And so, the National Assembly held several debates and discussions about the issue of slavery. But the National Assembly was not successful in completely abolishing slavery. Why do you think it happened this way? This is because the National Assembly was fearing opposition from the merchants. So the merchants were the ones who were gaining more and more wealth by exploiting the slaves, by buying and selling the slaves. And the National Assembly feared that if slavery was abolished, then these merchants whose prosperity depended to a great extent on this practice of slavery would now start revolting against this assembly itself. But we have learnt about how radical a government the Jacobin government was. And it was finally the National Convention, that is, this Jacobin government, that in the year 1794 legislated to free all slaves in French overseas possessions. So this came as a bright ray of light to those enslaved Africans who were brutally tortured and were compelled to labor extensively in the North American colonies as well as the Caribbean islands. But this was not a very long-lasting thing, because after Napoleon became the Emperor of France in 1804, he again began the practice of slavery. Because this practice of slavery that was put an end to in 1794 by the National Convention was further renewed during the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. And finally, it was in the year 1848 that slavery was abolished in all French colonies. So this now brings us to an end of our discussion on the abolition of slavery as it was engendered by the French Revolution. Because prior to the French Revolution, the French monarchy never thought of abolishing slavery because it depended to a great extent on the exploitation of slave labor, on the exploitation of these people who were not able to exercise their own rights in this process. But it was finally when the National Assembly came to power that this issue of slavery was now being discussed and debated among the people. And finally, it was the National Convention that legislated to free all slaves. But this was not the end of slavery in the truest sense of the term, because Napoleon renewed this thing, and it was finally in 1848 that slavery was abolished in all French colonies. In a subsequent lesson, we will be focusing on the great impact that this French Revolution has left behind on different parts of the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million-plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.